Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Brandis. I'm with the Colorado Small Business Development Center Network's SBDC TechSource Commercialization Program. I'd like to welcome you all today to Employee Ownership in Tech, New Ways to Compensate Your Team. We're glad you could join us, and we hope that you'll receive some great takeaways today. We're very happy to be able to offer this webinar in collaboration with the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade's Employee Ownership Office. Very quickly, I'd like to introduce you to our Colorado SBDC TechSource program, which is designed to support science and technology ventures throughout the state of Colorado. Different from many accelerators and incubators that lead to equity funding, the SBDC TechSource focuses especially on sources of non-dilutive capital. We provide customized expert consulting at no cost to you, as well as relevant workshops and events throughout the year. Topics may include SBIR, STTR, and advanced industry grant proposals, R&D tax credits, technology commercialization, IP protection, market research, market sizing, strategic and tactical planning, access to capital, and much more. These resources are available thanks to support from SBA's FAST program, VISA, the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade, Zero, Minority Business Office, and the City of Boulder. If you're a business located in a rural part of Colorado or are minority or women-owned, we may have additional resources to help you, so please reach out. A few quick things. After the webinar, if you're interested in meeting one-on-one with an SBDC TechSource specialist or attending events, workshops, or other webinars, please visit our website, sbdc-techsource.org, to get started. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email following the presentation with a link to the recording as well as any additional resources. Just a few housekeeping things. Everyone is currently on mute. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat bar, and we'll get to them at the end of today's session. We will leave quite a bit of time for Q&A. If you don't get your question answered today, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Now, I would like to turn it over to Jason Weiner to get us started with the panel discussion.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to all for attending this morning. Welcome to this panel presentation. I'm excited to have our panelists and a conversation around compensation in technology with an emphasis on employee ownership. My name is Jason Weiner. I'm the founder and principal of Jason Weiner PC, a boutique law and consulting practice focused on broad-based ownership and alternative financing. I'm also the chair of the Colorado Employee Ownership Commission, and I'm excited to be joined today by my co-commissioner, Chung Lee, Ali Clark, and I believe Nathan Schneider will be joining us. I think he's having some technical difficulties. And so I welcome you all today. This is going to be a high-level introduction to various forms of equity and ownership opportunities for employees and workers in technology ventures, with an eye toward creative and alternative forms of equity sharing. I'm joined again by panelists Ali Clark, Chung Lee, and Nathan Schneider. We're going to go a little bit out of order here to accommodate Nathan's delay. And so, Ali, I'm going to start with you if you're ready. I've asked each panelist to briefly introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their practice, and high-level overview of the types of worker equity and employee ownership that they have seen and have used in their practice. And then we'll have time for discussion toward the end of the presentation. If you do have questions that you want to drop in the chat box, we will be monitoring that later in the presentation. So without further ado, Ali, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yeah, my name is Ali Clark. I work with Sage Law Group here in Boulder, Colorado. We represent, we're a smaller law firm. We are highly focused on basically outside corporate representation and transactional and commercial work. We represent a lot of startups, emerging growth companies in all different industries and fields. And we focus a lot on everything from day one of your company, from entity choice through the fundraising process, the hiring and firing process, if that's something that you have to experience, and through mergers and acquisitions, exits, and as well as commercial representation. And a lot of my practice as essentially outside corporate counsel is focused on helping companies to structure their ownership and their, their entity choice and how that plays into ownership, as well as, largely advising them on how to reach their goals from a legal perspective, as well as the business side. So when you're thinking about ownership and employee ownership, I think that the most important thing to think about is the needs and goals of your company. I will say that I have never done the same thing twice for any company. It's not cookie cutter, and what is right for a bunch of Silicon Valley companies may not be right for you. And I'm sure most people know or have heard of, traditional stock options and equity incentives as a way of incentivizing employees. But the reality is that there is so much more, and a lot of these other structures have been around for a really long time. But deciding what is right for you really requires some thought and some planning with respect to the goals of the company. Now, a lot of times, so I'm going to touch on not so much traditional stock options. I'm going to just give you a little bit of insight into, some other plans and approaches that are more broad-based employee ownership focused. And again, this all requires you to think a lot about, what do you want as a company? If you're a very closely held company and you'd like to transition your company to employee ownership, where those employees are given the option to purchase shares from current owners, that may be, an approach for you. That may be what your company wants. Obviously, that may not be right for a startup that is just at the founding stages and is dealing with the initial founder's equity and maybe 1 or 2 employees. Maybe you're a closely held company, and instead all you want to do is provide your employees with ownership as a reward for the time and effort they're putting in and the growth that they're providing to the company. I would say an employee stock ownership plan may be an option, but traditional stock option plans are also something to consider there. And then if you're a relatively new company and very small, some of the things you need to think about and why I would advise you to reach out to your advisors and tax advisors, especially with respect to a lot of this conversation, and your lawyer, is that some plans and some approaches may not be right for the size of your company. But to briefly talk, there's I don't want to say these are non-traditional, because worker cooperatives and employee stock ownership plans have been around for a really, really long time. I just think that the traditional stock option that you see from Silicon Valley companies is just something that we hear more about in the news and social media. But employee stock ownership plans are something that, as I mentioned, would be for a bit of a larger company that is really trying to transition business ownership to their employees. These types of plans are pretty expensive to set up, and they typically require, or they're funded by the company. So think of like a company that's been operating for a while, has quite a bit of revenue, but really wants to avoid selling the company to, you know, a much larger company that's going to essentially wipe away their legacy in a way, is a way to think about it. So they would set up a plan. These are like a 401k essentially. They're funded by the company, and employees can you know, decide to have money withheld from their paycheck to buy stock, and over time the employees would, you know, own a certain chunk or all of the company. Worker cooperatives are another thing that, you know, I see not a ton of, but they're I think becoming a little more popular with companies that want to do some non-traditional employee ownership. These are, you know, where the employees essentially own 100% of the company, and they also have large governing rights, and they make up the board. That's another approach. It's definitely a little bit cheaper than these employee ownership plans that are more like a trust, and governed by some pretty heavy tax rules. Pretty easy for employees to buy in and to get out. And they include a profit sharing portion that is something that you may want to consider if you're thinking outside of the box. Typical stock options under a traditional plan give, you know, an employee the right to buy some stock in a company, but until the company sells, they're worth the paper that they're written on. Whereas in a worker cooperative, not only do you own part of the company, but you would receive profits in certain situations yearly. And the last would be like an employee ownership trust. They're sometimes called perpetual employee trusts, and you know, they're similar to where your employees don't necessarily pay for the ownership benefits, but they receive a share of the company's annual profits. Again, lower costs, easier to start up. And I'm not exactly sure where I'm at on time. I think I'm getting close, but you know, the key here, and I'm trying to give you just a tiny little insight into the world of possibilities, is that you need to have conversations with advisors and think about where you want your company to go. And having those conversations even early in the life of your company. Maybe an employee stock ownership plan isn't right for you today, but you want to get there someday. Planning for that is something that you know, your legal and your tax advisors can help you think about and help you be more likely to achieve those goals down the road. That being said, everything could change. You know, companies pivot all the time, and maybe bringing in venture capital funding is something that you're going to need to do, and they want to see a traditional stock option plan. That, you know, you're still incentivizing your employees and giving them an ownership stake under those traditional plans. But yeah, you know, my big picture thing is this really depends on what you as a company want, and you know, there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, and you should have advisors that should be able to give you a very broad range of structures and models to create the company that you want to create. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Allie. That is sage advice from Allie Clark at Sage Law. Had to drop in a little dad joke there. Well, thank you. That was a great overview from a startup perspective. Next, we're going to invite Chung Lee to share a bit about his practice and some remarks from the perspective of an emerging growth and maybe even more of a mature company. Chung, welcome, and love to hear from you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Ali. Ali actually and I actually share, as far as our practice, a pretty similar and common approach. Um, my name is Chung Lei, and I'm with 3i Law. I was actually with a national firm until the middle of the pandemic when I decided, hey, let's go out and start my own practice, which is always smart. And so, I think, right now, so we started 3i, in the middle of summer of 2020, and we have about 10 attorneys right now working with us. And my background is I'm actually a tax attorney, but I only use tax as a tool, not as the guiding principle to lead what I'm doing. So what I do is I work with individuals and families and small and medium-sized businesses, because all those the individuals, the families, and the small and medium-sized businesses all end up being in the same circle, as Ali can and Jason will can attest to, is they all function together. Once you get into the public companies, it's a little bit different. And what I work with these families and these businesses, what our focus is working with them on their growth strategies and as well as their legacy and our exit strategy. I want to throw out some statistics because it kind of helps us understand the importance of employee ownership. In the United States, there's over 30 million small businesses, and I'm sure that most of you guys know that small businesses is anything considered under 500 employees. So these small and medium-sized businesses makes up 99.9% of all businesses in the United States. So from a macro level, can you imagine if all these small businesses just kind of stops doing business, or they're no longer sustainable? I think as a country, we would be in really big trouble, right? These numbers are so staggering. It's not like we're gonna get, these small businesses are gonna get a bailout from the government somehow. And then, closer to home in Colorado, there's about close to 600,000 small businesses that employs over 1 million people. So again, something that hits closer to home is, can you imagine if, the vast majority of all these small businesses just goes kaput, and there's no succession planning, or there's no exit strategy? What's going to happen to the 1 million employees that are out there in Colorado? I think that I know that all of us can take a very good guess as to what's going to happen, and I think that's why it's so important for Governor Polis. I don't speak on his behalf here, but that's why he sees the value of employee ownership and using it as a vehicle to make sure that these companies are going to be sustainable, and that there's going to be a continuance and continuation of these companies regardless of what ends up happening to the, I call them the founders, or the people who started the company. So that's why these things, and Ali hit it right, the nail on the head, is that it's an ongoing conversation. You need to continuously think about it, and you don't wait until the end to think about it. You have to continue thinking about it at every stage of a business cycle. And so as far as that business cycle, what I would say is I always divide it into three stages. So if you think about a pie chart, there's three pieces of the pie. There's the inception and the emerging growth of the company, which is the initial piece of the pie. And then the second piece of the pie is going to be the growth and expansion. And then, of course, the last one is going to be, well, all right, we made enough money, everything seems to be happy, business is kind of on cruise control a little bit. And that's the next stage that a lot of individuals and families start thinking about, which is, well, how do I exit? And what's the legacy that I want to leave behind? And that part right there, I know that most people and most business owners don't really think about, but it's such an important factor to think about as you're starting your company, or as the company is growing, to think about, well, what's the legacy that I want to leave behind, and how do I exit from that? Because again, if we don't think about this, remember, I'm going to go back to the same number that I had mentioned previously, which is 99.9% of small businesses. And if people aren't thinking about that, it's going to just go kaput. unfortunately, most people, we have this utopia vision that, hey, I started this great company, someone's gonna go in and just buy me out, and I walk to the sunset. The reality is, and I'm sure that both Jason and Ali and Jamie can attest to, how often does that happen when your company, when a small business gets bought out by a third company? The number is actually very small. Okay, so at all these stages, there's challenges that people face. Look, when you're in the inception and when you're just starting the company out, all you're going to be focusing on is, how do I make a profit? How do I grow? How do I sell this this widget or this product? Or how do I sell my service? You're just trying to stay alive and make sure that you can keep the lights on. Okay, so that's not really what we're talking about as far as employee ownership. But then on stage 2 and stage 3, on the growth and expansion, part of the growth is, of any companies, how do you retain the talent? How do you reward people who've been with you? I mean, like, even when all you had to eat because you didn't make enough money was ramen every day in and day out, but those people stuck with you. How do you incentivize them to make sure that, hey, these are loyal people? I always say is, look, you can teach the specific skill set, but you can't teach loyalty or honesty and good character. But so how do you make sure that you can retain those talent? And then similarly, when you're thinking about expansion, well, how are you going to gain talent? How are you going to bring people into the mix to make sure that you can grow? Because at some point, look, you can't be the visionary and you can't be the executioner. It's extremely difficult. But at some point, that's why you have to build your team of talent within the company if you want to continue to grow and expand. And then I promise I'll tie all of this together. And then on the stage 3, which is on the legacy and exit, is, all right, you only have, to me, it comes down to 3 options. Option 1, if you want to exit, close down the company, right? The founder decides, hey, I'm retiring. No, I'm just going to let all my employees go because I can't sell it. Option number 2 is to sell it to a third party. And like I said, that number is actually very small. It doesn't happen very often. And then, of course, option number 3 is to sell it to the people who you know and that can carry on that vision and that legacy that you created. And so how do you best do that? Well, if you think about it, if your employees were already part of the company and was already part of the decision-making process, and they feel, we always say, hey, take ownership of what it is that you're doing. So if you already have those things in place where employees are already part of the company, and again, all these questions I ask, how do you retain talent? How do you gain talent? How do you make sure that your legacy lives on, and that you are able to exit in a very smooth fashion? It all boils down to employee ownership. And like what Ali was saying before, there's many ways of structuring the employee ownership. It could be as simple as, if you're a small company doing, if you want to get your mindset to it, it can be as simple as just doing profit sharing, right? That's the simplest thing of doing, is saying, hey, you're going to get a bonus. But the thing is, there should be some sort of formalized way of doing it. Or it could, go as far as, creating an ESOP. I mean, and, the big one that I think we've all heard about was a New Belgium brewing that, that was the employee ownership, and that was a huge ESOP. So the thing is, and I just mentioned, the profit sharing as the really easy way of doing it, to a much more complex and dynamic way of doing it, which is the ESOP. But like Ali was saying, there's so many options in between. And but so employee ownership isn't just those 2 things, but when you're working with your advisors, they should be able to based on what your goals are, be able to bring it all together and give you all the wide range of options. And you don't have to limit yourself to, hey, I'm just doing this and not doing that. No, it's all about saying what your goals are and saying, what are all the options in order for me to accomplish those goals. So we're working with a company right now that literally we're putting in place profit sharing. We're putting restricted grants as well as restricted stock ownership. So again, they don't have to be exclusive of each other. They can be inclusive of one another. So I hope, I just want to give an overview of why it's so important to think about employee ownership, as a company. And if you happen to be the owner, think about how, this is a great way of making sure that your company grows and it's sustainable. For me, it's so important to think about, and for most business owners who have gone to this, who've gotten to this stage of success, it's always about what's the legacy that I want to create and what's the legacy that I want to leave behind. And to me, in doing this for the last 20 years, it's what's the best way of doing that? And the best way of doing that is through some form of employee ownership, where you have trusted people who can carry on that legacy and that vision that you've created initially. So that's all I have for you. So back to you, Jason.
Thank you, Chung. Well, hopefully the audience is hearing that there are lots of options and that the options can be tailored to suit the objectives of the individual. And you've heard a practitioner's perspective. We have Nathan Schneider, who's having some video trouble, but he is on. He'll be presenting by audio only. My apologies for that. But Nathan is here, and Nathan will close us out with a provocation to think expansively from a creative and more conceptual framework for how to share ownership. And Nathan has a deep background in tech, and so we welcome his insights to help kind of seed a question and answer session for afterwards. Nathan, we welcome you, and we'd love for you to introduce yourself and help to give us some seedlings for an imaginative discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Jason. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can. It's crystal clear. Thank you.
Good. I have a great background in that. My two Linux machines are no longer compatible with GoTo, and so sorry about all of this. But I'm so glad to be with you. This is an important discussion, and I'm really glad to the chance to share a bit about what we've been doing in my Media Enterprise Design Lab at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And just know that I'm very eager to help make the University of Colorado a resource for this growing movement for employee ownership in Colorado. The ESOP was first developed by Louis Kelso, who is a double graduate of CU Boulder, and both in the economics department and the law school. And so I'm very proud to represent that legacy here at CU and to help make sure we're thinking forward about possibilities the way he was. We're able to talk about employee ownership the way we are today because people like him and Louis Kelso himself saw a possibility that wasn't presently available then, and worked through rigorous experimentation and through policy strategies and policy reform, really on a bipartisan basis to create the possibility, at least enabled by the ESOP. And his vision was much bigger, was a possibility where not only employee ownership, which he thought of as the Trojan horse, but that actually broad-based ownership of many kinds would be possible. And that legacy that I've been particularly interested in, especially since the online economy really challenges a lot of our notion of the employee relationship, of what it means to be an employee and the roles of employees in our economy. And so it invites us to get even more creative than just employee ownership, and to think about that a broader horizon. So for instance, a lot of the people working on our platforms are users, and they're contractors. They're not formal employees. The delivery drivers, the Uber drivers, the people doing various kinds of piecework, the Airbnb hosts. Interestingly, a lot of these companies have in recent years been gesturing toward wanting to involve more ownership in their platform designs. So for instance, Uber and Airbnb asked the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2008 if they could share equity more freely with drivers or with their core users. The SEC hasn't quite granted that request, so they created kind of phantom mechanisms for doing that. Airbnb started a profit sharing program and a kind of post oversight kind of advisory commission. So they're trying to simulate forms of user ownership through their companies. And it's just a demonstration that there is a tremendous opportunity here to better align our stakeholders, in addition to our employees, with the companies that we're building. And this isn't just those jobs. It's really, this work is being pioneered on the ground with startups and other companies that are exploring these kinds of options. And Colorado has really been ground zero for that kind of work. I've been building around the idea of exit to community for the last year or so, and this really is directly inspired by work, for instance, that Jason has done in enabling conversions of the kind that we've been talking about. One example of this was State Solar, a worker-owned co-op here in Boulder that Jason was in the transition for, and it kind of plants the seed of exiting to shared ownership was just a normal thing for startups. Was just something that rather than the current options, which are exiting to an acquisition or to an IPO, exiting to some form of shared ownership was just part of the possible pathways that startups were working toward. And so I've been collaborating with different groups, investor groups, organizations doing legal structures to enable that to happen using cooperative models, using trusts like ESOPs and other kinds of trusts, and a range of options, as blockchain-based structures, which is something that Colorado has really been in the lead on, where we're looking at tokens as a mechanism of ownership for how we share ownership beyond just the formal employment relationship. An example of that happening here in Colorado is Opolis, which is a structure that is using blockchain technology, creating a kind of employment company on the basis of very fancy new tech, is using a cooperative legal structure at the basis of. So it's a new kind of worker cooperative, where rather than being focused on an employment relationship, it's kind of clusters of temp workers who are using both blockchain technology to share kind of tokenized assets, as well as the cooperative legal structure to ground their work in a very robust legal above ground framework. This is in the context of technology that's a lot of open questions in terms of its regulatory situation, and Colorado has really been on the leading edge of enabling both blockchain technology and cooperative legal structures. So it's really the best place in the country you could have to experiment with some of these emerging models. All of this is to say, these are all things that still have to develop. Employee ownership versions, a lot of the kinds of things that we've been talking about here so far, these are tried and true methods. I'm thinking of Dojo Ford, the street from me here in Boulder, where a small group of owners converted this tech shop, doing really good work, into an employee-owned cooperative, and we're able to meet their needs in terms of getting a return on the process and having more ability as leaders of the company, as well as being able to share the future wealth with their with their workers. These kinds of methods are really tried and true, and we should keep building on those. At the same time, we should recognize that there's so much more we could be imagining. And if you're in the position where you're trying to explore something new, where you want to share ownership beyond just the formal employees, and you want to create a kind of a value that goes beyond, that reaches as far as your technology can reach. There are some emerging opportunities, pioneering models, and this stuff has been so quickly. It's just always surprising to me. Just a few years ago, I was involved in a shareholder campaign asking the company Twitter to even consider user ownership. And we had a lot of fun. We got a lot of media coverage, but at the time it was presented often as this is just crazy talk. Then now, just a few years later, we have big companies, Uber, Airbnb, making strong cases to the federal government for why they want to do shared ownership as part of their model. And we need to build on that, push those companies, and create a race to the top where more democratic ownership and governance is just what we expect the tech company. And this legacy of employee ownership is kind of the foundation upon which we can build that next phase of creativity and inclusivity in the online economy. So if you're interested in this stuff, Jason's just put a link in the chat as a kind of resource page at the university that has our free that we've published a introducing the idea of exit to community, lots of webinars that we've been producing, and resources that you can dig into. And if you're interested in exploring these options further, I'm always happy to point you in the most appropriate directions. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Again, I'm sorry about the video issues, but I'm so grateful to be here.
Thank you for your remarks, Nathan, and thank you to my panelists, Ali and Chung. Before we get into audience questions, and I'll ping you all again to think about and either drop questions in our question block or in the chat bar. We welcome those. I want to kind of wrap some of this content up in a framework to help understand. So, we're living in a moment now when legally defined relationships and legal regimes of regulation are struggling to catch up to the fast pace of evolution in technology and organizational structures, especially in the pandemic. Organizational design has become more horizontal. Most people are working remotely. We're seeing the world of work change before our eyes. The overwhelming majority of workers in America are self-employed contractors and not W-2 employees. That's been evolving since the 90s. And as these legal relationships change, so too are corporate structures. But yet the corporation or the business entity form exists within a legal framework. And as you begin to unpack what your founder vision is or what the future holds, you have to be aware of the various intersecting regimes of regulation and bodies of law that apply here. And each of our panelists has referenced some. So there are specific and very complex tax rules around equity compensation, particularly with respect to restricted stock, non-qualified stock options, incentive stock options, and they will affect employees differently than contractors. Nathan referenced changes in securities laws. And so offering equity to employees or contractors, for that matter, requires compliance with, again, complex securities laws. And unfortunately, unlike technology, these legal regimes don't talk to each other. The IRS doesn't talk regularly to the SEC. And so we have an actual we have to navigate these with smart advice, with creativity. At the same time, we're navigating changing employment regulations and corporate structures. We have advents of new corporate structures like cooperatives and public benefit corporations and employee ownership trusts. And that's not to overwhelm you, that's to signal that with smart advice and careful planning and good advisors, the world is your oyster. The range of creative design and intention that you bring to a conversation, be aware that the needle can be threaded. And it's, as practitioners, we're all steeped in this every day. While Chung is a tax lawyer, I'd venture to guess you're doing your fair share of employment work and corporate work and equity comp work. We all are. And as a result, it's important to have partners and advisors who can understand the landscape and piece together not only best practices, but also to identify the traps and to understand where things are moving. The law is slow to catch up. The law is usually the very last institution to catch up to the creativity of the business community and certainly capital markets and tech entrepreneurs. With that, I wanted to ask panelists questions around trends and patterns. What has kind of either made you scratch your head, or what's been kind of a noodling creative question that's come to you? What is conceptually been an interesting example that's come across your inbox or your desk that's made you think in a new way about some of these structures? And Ali, I'll start with you. And that can be a question, big or small.
Sure. You know, I think that, and this is less specific to one situation, but you know, I think that as I am starting to see younger founders, and I'll back up a little bit. I represent companies who the founder or the CEO is on their third or fourth or fifth company, and they are very experienced, and they have been doing, you know, standing up and selling startups for a while. Again, selling isn't the something that happens every day, but there are a lot of serial founders, or what we call them. They tend to lean towards the traditional in running their companies and structuring their companies and funding their companies. As I see younger and younger founders coming out of universities or just starting companies on their own, I am seeing a shift in you know, what does the company want to accomplish from a social perspective? How do they want to be viewed in the industry? You know, there's a lot of talk about how Airbnb or Uber really pushed the limits in terms of, you know, structuring companies differently and being disruptive. Even past that, I'm seeing a larger group of founders that want to have social impact, and they are thinking more broadly at the outset about how they want their company to be viewed in the public eye from day one. And that is very important to them. And it's not about just getting this technology up and running and getting a large exit. And so I think we're very much so seeing a shift there, and that is requiring me to constantly be trying to have in my toolbox ways to help them be successful and put into place programs and policies and models and structures in the formation of their company that will help them reach their goals. You know, if they want to really be known for always purchasing sustainable products and you know, giving their employees the best possible benefits and you know, incentives to, you know, be a part of the company, then my toolbox has to continually evolve to accommodate that. And I think that's something that we are going to see much more of in the coming years. And you know, I think you make a very good point, Jason, that a lot of times there's a failure for institutions and structures to catch up as quickly as people would like. And I'll, I can say that I know there's at least one question on the question board already that the answer is attorneys and tax advisors and the SEC and the IRS are all in different spots trying to get there. And it's not as easy as being like, oh yeah, it's this easy as a stock option plan. So that makes me, think a lot and try to plan for how I can best serve those clients that they don't really want the cookie cutter approach to their company and the way that they have done things before. That there are new ways of doing it and pushing those boundaries, and I need to be creative and a problem solver for my clients, because I don't ever want to be the person that just says, no, that's not really how we do things, right? Because that's just me putting up a barrier to you being creative in your company and your focus. And I don't ever want to do that. So
Thanks for that. There was a technical question here that I'll make a quick go of, and then I've got a question for Chung. One question is, what is a restricted stock grant? There are, generally speaking, for traditional equity compensation or equity incentive plans, there are generally three options in those plans. There's restricted stock, and then there's two different forms of options, incentive stock options and non-qualified stock options. Restricted stock is a class of common stock generally that's offered pursuant to an equity incentive plan. An equity incentive plan is a plan document that is that's authorized by the board of directors and sometimes also consented to by shareholders, by which common shares are reserved for employees, contractors, and advisors as a form of equity compensation. The plan itself is required by Rule 701 of the Securities Act and specific sections of the tax code relating to employee comp. And restricted shares are grants of actual shares of common stock, generally subject to repurchase obligations and forfeiture, otherwise known as vesting. And the restrictions are generally in two respects. One is there are restrictions in terms of forfeiture, vesting. The other is there are restrictions in terms of transfer. The shares are not freely liquid and they're subject to repurchase obligations by the company. But they're different than options because they are actual shares that confer all the rights of common stock, voting rights, dividends rights, if there are any, and liquidity rights if the shares are sold in an acquisition. That's different than stock options, which are hybrid instruments. They are contractual options exercisable for the acquisition of common shares. I call them derivative instruments because you can issue somebody an option grant and they don't hold the stock. Their name is not on your cap table. They hold an instrument, a coupon, a piece of paper, again, subject to vesting, that allows them to exercise the purchase of common stock later on into the future at a predetermined exercise price. There are high degree of technical requirements for NSOs and ISOs under the tax code with significant tax consequences. So those should be vetted and discussed with tax advisors. That's the short answer to the world of equity comp. My question for Chung is, the traditional notion of exit and kind of liquidity is driven by capital markets, often private equity and venture capital. Any comfort or perspective you can give to attendees that holds open the possibility of transitioning a business to something other than a private equity firm or raising money from venture capital? I think that has put the blinders on a lot of founders' eyes in thinking the only way to grow is to raise a series A, B, C, D, D, E, and then either IPO or sell. What other forms of liquidity or capital have you worked with or have you thought of or have been presented to you as alternatives?
Sure, give me that question. I'd rather have Ali's question. I think, when we're thinking about employee ownership, the great thing about the employee ownership, it's that liquidity event is already built in. So more recently, we've done a hybrid for some of our clients where, we, all, and depending on the percentage that these owners wants to, set aside for employee ownership, we put some, like kind of what you were talking about on the restricted grants. We put in certain language to allow for essentially the founders to drag or tag along, which is not a foreign concept to I know to most people, but that's essentially it's just a hybrid form of employee ownership with the drag along and tag along. So that way, if they end up going down the path of saying, hey, we found a third party buyer or whatnot, it doesn't get bogged down because there's employee ownership. But to me, it's I think employee ownership automatically gives you that ability, as far as the exit strategy, as far as whether the employee ends up taking over. And you think about when you're structuring in ESOP, that's essentially the founder being able to exit, but then the company still goes into perpetuity. And so to me, I think it's already built into that system. And whoever the advisor is, or most of the advisors that we work with, and as well as other attorneys who are in this area, they understand that, we need to build all those systems in to make sure that if the whole company wants to exit for whatever reason, that they'll be able to exit smoothly. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great. That was a hardball question. That was a great answer. Nathan, my question for you is, what examples can you describe that suggest that this is more than conceptual? There are examples of companies that have either exited or grown to scale. I'm thinking Mondragon has some high-tech and capital-intensive elements. What are some examples you can cite in tech and beyond to just give folks the comfort that this has been done, it can be done, and that the kind of core values that have led to tech innovation can also lead to kind of broad-based wealth sharing? Yeah, what sort of data points can you elucidate?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a lot of ways, the challenge here is still a challenge for us, and I feel like we have partial examples, but not the kinds of not the full examples that we'd like to see. I think we're kind of in 1950 from the perspective of employee ownership, especially through a kind of ESOP model. There's a concept out there. There's a plausibility. There are projects that are trying it in different ways. So, for instance, a company that is based in both Europe and in the Bay Area here, called Purpose, is doing deals where they're setting up a purpose trust inside a company that is holding some of the stock. So they've worked with platforms like Tribe, which is a platform that kind of lets you deploy your own sharing economy. And so they're able to actually create a blended situation where the company has venture investors. So they went through some semi-conventional venture rounds, but then they also have this kind of they're able to include other components, that what they call steward ownership, through this trust. These are all, these are kind of partial examples. I also think it's important to think about, well, one more that partial, almost their example was meetup.com. So about a year and a half ago or so, Meetup was on the chopping block. It had been bought by WeWork, large kind of working space company, and then WeWork ran into trouble and was trying to shed assets, and Meetup was part of that. Meetup is, profitable, successful company, actually, believe it or not, money from its users who pay to, host meetups and, the in-person gatherings and so forth. And this is a case where the founder really wanted to, Scott Heiferman really wanted to become like a user cooperative. He built this thing on goodwill of those users and wanted to, thought that this is the right vision for the company. Still, we just don't have the kind of mature investor ecosystem, investor education, where we could, where we had a stable of people who understood what this would look like, understood what, how to do leverage, co-op transition of this sort, the way we can do leverage employee ownership conversions. So right now, that is a reminder that we need to build up that kind of stock, build up some flows to enable that kind of thing to happen. One other really important lesson that currently working on building into a case study is a different way of thinking of scale. And it's not quite in in tech per se, but in I'm going to turn back to that example I mentioned earlier, Namaste Solar, Jason's former employer. It's often celebrated as a worker-owned company, as a worker-owned cooperative, and it's great in respect. But in some ways, the most powerful scaling strategies that group of people has is actually by looking beyond just that one company. And so they've sent out a national purchasing code called ACUS. Now they've launched a national credit union called Clean Energy Credit Union, and they're associated with an investment fund that is also invested in Namaste and other similar companies, exchange, other worker cooperatives, other kinds of cooperatives, and clean energy companies. So in that case, because of the capital constraints that cooperatives often face, they found that they were able to achieve national scale by actually using different kinds of cooperative stakeholder structures with different highly focused companies. So each company in the ecosystem, that network, has a razor sharp mission. But together, those missions combine to create, a nationally scaled force in the, in the solar energy industry. So I think something that we should think about more, particularly once we are willing to get off the wagon, that the job of tech is to serve, venture capital's desire to, disrupt whole industries and drive, legacy businesses out of business. If we think instead the job of our, of our tech is to actually empower local businesses and empower businesses all over the place that already exist and redirect existing capital flows, maybe we can think about scale differently. So these models like cooperatives invite us a different way of thinking about scale. If I compare like the Home Depot down the road from the locally owned hardware store that's a member of Ace Hardware, that local store is able to achieve national economy scale, compete with Home Depot, but be a much better hardware store because it's local through that cooperative. So if we recognize the power of cooperatives to change how we think about scale, I think we'll also be able to unlock some possibilities.
Thank you. That raises, I think, a really interesting theme to close out the discussion, which is that employee ownership does not just have to be a surgical tool to extract more from workers or to incentivize and reward workers. On the spectrum of options, employee ownership is actually could be in and of itself a part of the product feature. In tech, we think of tech as such a novel and sometimes unique sector, but really it's the same as any other business sector, except that its chief product is an intangible piece of property instead of a widget or something physical and tangible. And in a certain respect, tech is the ideal sector in which to experiment and expand and promote employee ownership, because we think of product design to solve problems, to create solution sets for users. And we can sometimes lose sight of the integrated notion that our workers are also our owners, are also our users. And in some ways, the best ideas, the best solutions come from the people who are working with this solution set. And that's not always, Ford, for instance, Henry Ford, in developing the modern day assembly line, had a belief that his workers were actually also his customers, and he sought and actually exposed himself to great liability for trying to pay workers enough to afford the very product they worked on. And if we think about our workers as part of the virtuous loop of value creation and insight, we can build worker ownership into the product design. It is a part of the feature of the business, creating highly responsive, adaptive solutions to problems. And that's what tech is uniquely suited to do. Hopefully our speakers have inspired some imagination and creativity. Hopefully you'll go back and make the lives of your lawyers and bankers and tax advisors a little bit more challenging and exciting, because really there are lots of options. There is no one path. The world of venture capital is certainly one of them. It's certainly appropriate and has its place, but so too are other options. And looking at the long term is just as critical as looking at the bottom line. With that, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd like to again thank panelists Ali Clark, Chung Lee, Nathan Schneider, and thank you to the SBDC and the Office of Economic Development and International Trade for hosting us today. We will be sending out an email with all the panelists' contact information and with some links. So stay tuned and check your inbox.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you, everyone. Good to be with you.